Tonight, a child will die. Tonight, a mother in Egypt will wail at the death of her firstborn child. A father will grieve the death of his beloved son or daughter. Tonight, the powerful will not escape their fate. Kings and princes, priests and generals will lose the first of their precious offspring. The sons and daughters of potters, farmers, and bakers too will die. Yes, even the firstborn horses, cows, cats, and dogs will die. Tonight, a child will die. What happens tonight is not news. The story goes that for God's people, the Egyptian land of refuge has become the land of oppression. For generations, Pharaoh has laid claims on the lives of his subjects, native and foreign alike, and all live in service of some higher goals. Like all systems of power and control, systems that have come before, systems that have come since, systems that are still today, Egypt too demands blood to legitimize its coercive authority. Tonight, God will turn the lethal aspect of power onto itself, so it may devour itself in order to create a new beginning. But first, children will die. In February 1994, as the violent breakup of the former Yugoslav Republic entered its third year of open conflict, a small battalion of Dutch soldiers serving as part of the UN Protection Force settled in a small Bosnian town of Srebrenica to protect the vulnerable Muslim population of the valley. Dutch Bad, as this military unit was called, consisted of 300 lightly armored infantry soldiers and 300 medical and support staff. In the preceding years, Bosnian Serbs had raided and erased 296 villages in the larger Srebrenica area, displacing about 70,000 people and killing over 3,000 people. The remaining population came to depend on Dutch Bad for its protection. However, in the summer of '95, Bosnian Serb forces surrounded the enclave, and calls by the overwhelmed and overpowered protectors for UN air support went unanswered. On July 11th, the enclave fell, and 30,000, mostly women and children, were left defenseless. Survivors recount how men and boys as young as 12 years old are rounded up, never to be seen again. Survivors recount countless stories of indiscriminate intimidation and humiliation. Survivors recount horrific scenes of murder and rape, heartbreaking to hear and impossible to retell. Today, 8,737 people have been listed as official victims of the fall of Srebrenica. In these dark days in July, little over 20 years ago, are now recognized as Europe's first genocide since the end of World War II. A genocide of my generation. In a world that so easily unleashes hell upon another, the witness of the first Passover in Egypt is crucial for what it does and for what it doesn't do. Of course, the first Passover is about liberation and about a God whose enduring faithfulness restores an oppressed people to freedom and dignity. But it is also about divine violence. God says, "Tonight I will execute my judgment on the gods of Egypt. Tonight I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both human being and animal. I am the Lord." God shows that God can do what the gods of Egypt have done before, claim human life in the exercise of power and authority. But God will do so more powerfully. "I am the Lord. I will execute my judgment on the gods of Egypt." With these words, God reveals God to be as violent as the other powers of this world. With these words, God joins the ranks of all the forces that have claimed blood in the pursuit of higher goals. May they be the grandeur of the nation, the protection of the state, the safety of a people, or our liberation from oppression. Do we conveniently excuse a violent God when God's violence and anger happen to the benefit of our side? Divine violence executed in the act of liberation and restoration still remains just that, violence. Yet I am a child of that violent God. I am because my hope rests on what doesn't happen in this text. God doesn't unleash something on the world hasn't already unleashed upon itself. The violence of Egypt and the violence of this world have claimed countless victims, especially among the young, the weak, and the defenseless. And tonight is not to be any different. A violent world will see a deadly night. But the first Passover is not to be a continuation of this narrative. God says, "This month will mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." Though the violence of this world continues uninterrupted, this violence is assumed into the divine plan of liberation and restoration. In and through the violence of this world, God reaches out to God's people. If anything, God lets the world be the world at its best and at its worst. Yet violence will not have the final word in this story. Had the story of Exodus been told at a different time, we probably would have heard stories of heroic uprisings and resistance, of a downtrodden people who started fighting back against their oppressor, of heroes inspired by visions and dreams, and by a God who calls people to follow a higher law. Had the story of Exodus been told today, it would have been the story of books and movies, when victims rise up defiantly, gloriously, and ultimately victoriously against their aggressor. But Exodus expresses these truths differently. God's people are not to take part in the expected and legitimate violence of this world. They are to eat their meal with loins girded, sandals on the feet, staff in the hand, and to do so hurriedly. The role of avenging angel does not belong to us. We are to be sojourners in a violent world. Our redemption does not come from violence. but from God who says, I will pass you by. In the decades after the fall of Srebrenica, the survivors of the community, those who dared to return to the place that had seen such unspeakable yet familiar horrors, have opened a memorial site, joining the legacy of all human genocide in the hope that these evils may no longer exist in this world. Here, a tour guide recounts how he sat in a bus, leaving the violated safety of the Dutch Bad base. He recounts how this bus was stopped, how men are separated from their wives, sons from their mothers, but he is skipped over. As he tells his story of that horrible day, I expect him to be filled with anger, with a thirst for revenge, but he isn't. Like God's people dressed for a journey that leads them beyond violence, this man too has journeyed beyond that violence, beyond the violence of this world and the unquenchable thirst for revenge. This is where violence ends. Our world remains a violent place, from unspeakable genocide to everyday theft, aggression, and vandalism. From unkind words to the willful blind eye we cast upon those in need. From the destruction we inflict upon ourselves and those closest to us, to the ongoing annihilation of the natural world we all depend upon. In this violent world, children will continue to die. But our Passover song is not a distant memory of acts that do not need to be forgotten. It is a festival of the Lord, to celebrate that we are still passed over today. In a violent world, we are not to be defined by violence, but by our dependence upon God. As God passes you by today, hear the Passover song for a violent world. I will be with you all day and all the way.